It's so easy to lash out and hit send. On this show, we've often flagged the toxic culture of online speech. Now comes COVID. Just how much has all that extra screen time these past months amplified and enabled toxic behavior? When people feel alienated or threatened, one reaction is to pick on others, to bully. And the number one targets are women. From cyberbullying classmates to abusive partners and total strangers who are targeted, who people feel they can just sometimes let loose. How much of this toll has this pandemic taken on women? Now, here in France, the Me Too movement had already raised awareness, and there were calls to be on the lookout back in March for increased domestic violence, this from day one of the first lockdown. But does that include what happens online? How to counter the real-life consequences of the abuse that's too often rampant in the virtual world. Today in the France 24 debate, how to stop online violence against women. Joining us from Paris, Aurélie Garnier-Brun, she's spokesperson for the advocacy group En Avant Toutes, which means, I guess, all ahead. How would you describe it? All move ahead?
Hello, we usually translate it as Go Forward Girls.
Go Forward Girls, okay. You offer online counseling and support for victims of discrimination and abuse. Thank you for joining us. We want to thank as well Sei Akiwowo, founder and executive director of Glitch. Tell us what Glitch is.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Glitch is a UK charity determined to make the online space safe for all, particularly women and girls.
All right, well, thanks for joining us. From Brussels, Asha Allen, Policy and Campaigns Officer for the European Women's Lobby. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to join.
And from the French capital, we welcome back journalist and author Natacha Henry, consultant on gender-based violence. Thanks for being here.
Hello, thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Let's start, if you will, from images from Rome this Wednesday and a rally outside of the Italian parliament earlier to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Circumstances indeed different this year with COVID confinements high on everyone's mind. I guess, Aurélie Garnier-Brun, I'll begin by asking you, what have you learned these past months?
From the confinement, as an organization who is helping women suffering from violence, we have seen a huge increase of the violence they were experimenting. How we accompany women is through an online chat. We focus mainly on young women and LGBT plus people because they are often more vulnerable and overrepresented in the victims of violence. So it was kind of our strategy as an organization to also invest this cyberspace to kind of be able to reach out to this public more. And on our online chat, we noticed a 900% increase of the demands for help during the first confinement. So it was
that 900% increase. Is it because there were 900% more urgencies? How do you explain it?
It's explained also because we had to increase our opening time slots. We were open 5 days a week, and we had to open 7 days a week because the demands for help were just overflowing. I guess confinement had a big impact with people who were kind of trapped with their aggressors, abusers. Which made it more urgent for them to seek help. And since the confinement kind of limited their privacy, their ability to be able to call and talk about it on the phone to a hotline or be able to go seek help physically in an organization, the fact that it was online was a way to have help in a very discreet manner because they could just chat with us as their violent companion was right next to them watching TV or in bed sleeping. It was a very discreet way for them to have instant help.
Instant help. Asha Allen, your reaction to what Aurélie's been describing, and particularly the idea of taking the internet and using it as a tool of empowerment in this instance.
Yes, very much so, and I would of course like to thank for the great work that was happening on the ground, and reiterating that it was something that our members also saw from the very beginning of the pandemic. For the European Women's Lobby, we're the largest umbrella organisation of women's civil society in Europe, so we have over 2,000 member organisations, and very early on they were highlighting exactly what was just being explained. And so what we saw very early in April was about a 36% increase in France, for example, in cases of domestic violence, and similarly a five-fold increase in cases in Ireland. But what we also saw was some good practices in regards to using online tools to be able to raise the alarm on some of the experiences that were being had by women who were in a situation where they were more exposed to abusers and perpetrators of violence, but also online violence as well, which is, of course, part of that continuum of violence against women. So what we saw were apps being developed, civil society organizations being approached by small and medium-sized tech companies who were trying to find innovative ways for women to be able to raise the alarm and get the help and services that they needed. And we also saw some governments taking steps to make sure that services that women needed to be protected from violence and to be able to seek the help they needed became emergency services, which is, of course, something we've been calling for many, many years. And what we saw that as the pandemic created the scenario in which we could move forward on that specifically.
All right, so a proactive approach by governments and by advocacy groups like OIDs. Asha, you break it down for us. There's abusive behavior, and then there's online violence. Describe for us what online violence is.
So online gender-based violence against women and girls, I think we need to be very, very clear, is a continuation of the misogyny, the sexism and the violence that women experience in the offline world. So, of course, there are very specific forms that you've already mentioned, whether it's online stalking, online harassment, what we refer to as image-based sexual abuse, but also the use of online tools, online platforms in the perpetration of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, stalking and other forms of harassment. So it needs to be understood in a holistic and comprehensive way. And I'm sure, as the other panelists will touch upon as well, we also need to understand it through an intersectional lens. There are women who are at a heightened risk of experiencing this form of violence, whether it's from sexist hate speech or even to the use of AI to create deep fakes and to be able to use that against women and put them in sexually violent situations. And that's often targeted towards women in politics or women in the political arena. So I think there's an understanding that there may be a commonality of online violence from a cyberbullying perspective, but it needs to be seen from a much broader perspective of that and understood how many different forms there are and how digital tools are used to facilitate forms of violence that we are more familiar with.
So, Seiya Akiwo, you wrote about your own personal experience. It was a couple of years back. You stood up at a forum at the European Parliament and talked about reparations for colonialism. Let's take a listen.
So you guys mentioned very good ideas, and like you mentioned, they are temporary. So I'd like to run by you my idea of a long-term solution, which is for the EU, particularly former empires, the British Empire, French Empire, the Italian Empire, to pay reparations. I ain't finished yet. To pay reparations to the country that they had previously colonised within the last 80 years.
All right, as I can deduce from those images, say you're no pushover. Nonetheless, you did go in for a lot of abuse online. What was it like?
I mean, I think anyone can imagine what online bullying and abuse is like, but trying to deal with it across different platforms at the same time was pretty surreal. And I think it's not necessarily the abuse that was the problem. It was the response from the platforms that it was the biggest issue for me and what prompted me to set up Glitch. At that time, we weren't asking for anything new. We were just asking for social media companies to enforce their rules and to enforce their policies. But then when you do dig a bit deeper, you see that actually quite a lot of the policies do not have this intersectional lens, as Asha mentioned, and does not have a comprehensive online gender-based violence policy, looking at how dehumanizing language towards women and those with intersectional identities can have massive effects. And I think that's what was most disappointing. And sadly, in light of now lockdown and COVID, we're seeing online abuse only increase for two reasons. One, there's more people at home, more people online, and we're still behind in talking about digital citizenship education and equipping people with the rights and responsibility and efficacy when it comes to navigating the online space, as well as online security and defense and digital self-care. But also what's happening is a backlog in the need to talk about political education, to discussing racism, discussing gender equality. Those conversations that need to be happening offline haven't been had, and now we're doing it in a new forum online without any kind of outline or agreement on social norms.
So that video that we showed, that incident where you were then trolled, this was, nearly 4 years ago. You're saying that the tech giants haven't gotten any better at policing hate speech and online violence against women?
Well, let's look at how during lockdown, online abuse increased almost 50% for women in the UK. So that doesn't tell me or signify to me that we're making any progress. And if we are, it's not quick enough. We've seen a number of women in the UK take their lives or respond to the backlash of abuse and say they no longer want to engage in politics, no longer want to engage in their profession or entertainment, or no longer on the online space. This is a massive impact on our democracy. This is a massive impact on gender equality and human rights. And we're talking today on the day of eliminating violence against women. We can't make any progress towards that elimination if we don't look at how the online space adds to that and how tech companies are not being held to a high enough standard.
Whose job is it to hold them to a higher standard?
I think it's us as consumers, as users, demanding more from tech companies the way we demand a lot more from our politicians and the people that represent us in Parliament. And I also think it is for members of Parliament and policymakers to think about forms of regulation that looks at it through an intersectional lens, because the last thing we want is more policy and more regulation that only benefits the privileged few.
Natasha Henry, is it mission impossible asking, say, France or the European Union to regulate on this?
No, in the feminist world, nothing is mission impossible. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. But I have to underline that the European Court for Human Rights in February this year has acknowledged cyber violence as part of violence against women and girls. So it is going really high in now legislations, and I think monitoring is very, very urgent, and I absolutely agree with what has just been said. One thing I would like to underline is the difference maybe in the cyberbullying in the case of domestic violence, for instance, in a private relationship, intimate partner violence, where the abusive perpetrator will hack into your emails, send you 1 million text messages every day, hack into your bank account, use all the passwords you've given him or he's stolen or he's found. Everybody makes mistakes, and these abusers are very good with if you love me, give me your passwords. So of course women have to change all the passwords and never give them to anyone. So that's one thing, is the private thing. And then there's the public abuse, where people are putting things online and putting the woman's address online for everybody to know, and sharing private information. So there are two. You could be the victim of a perfect stranger, or the victim of someone you spent 10 years with or 10 days with. So it's a lot to process.
It's a lot to process, and are we getting better at it? Is my question. Because I remember speaking to a couple of France 24 correspondents, female ones, who told me, Natasha, who said to me, you know, on Twitter, I just get trolled too much. I'm just not that into it anymore. That was a couple of years back. Have things improved?
Well, I think the lady who spoke just before me is absolutely right. This is building another glass ceiling. I mean, there are, on my Facebook, I'm completely, happy and innocent because I don't want all this crap. So I can see how people would avoid it. And I'm shocked by what I see, what other friends and feminists get, kind of messages they get.
So what you're saying is you self-censor on, you're saying you self-censor on Facebook?
Don't fight back.
You self-censor on Facebook? You'd feel, I don't want to talk about politics.
Because I don't want to. Yeah, I know what I think. I know who my friends are, and I know who my allies are in the European Union and wherever in the world, and in the French state and government and the feminist groups. I know who my friends are. I don't need some stranger's opinion to go and ruin my day, really, because our work is tough, and having to make this place a better place and listen to the victims. And I train health professionals, for instance. Whenever I train health professionals, I have to make sure, when it's the class on domestic violence, now that it's online, I have to say to the people who are organizing this, the students at home, maybe they are in a situation like this. So can you make sure that maybe there's a safe space for them? Because if everybody's working from home, then the partner is there as well. So you always have to think about these things. And this is taking enough of our time.
Just very briefly, Asha Allen, because we're almost out of time, 30 seconds. Is it the same throughout Europe uniformly, or is it different according to what country you're in?
Yes, it's the same throughout Europe. Unfortunately, the experience for women and girls across Europe is the same. And I would just really reiterate the points that were just made by the speakers, whether this is a public act that happens to them or whether that's something that's happening in private, which is why it's so important for us to have this holistic analysis and comprehensive understanding of what we're talking about. It's interesting that you're talking to your colleagues, and there are many women like your colleagues, journalists, political activists, and women politicians who have to be in that public space in order to engage in the online world, and they have the right to be safe from violence there and shouldn't have to self-censor. So essentially, it is a case of all women and girls do deserve to live their lives free from all forms of violence against women, whether it's online or offline.
We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. It is currently the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And in this year of COVID, we are talking about online violence and how much it has spiked against women and girls. Talking about it with Aurélie Garnier-Brun, spokesperson for the advocacy group En Avant Toutes, which, remind us, Aurélie, how do you translate that in English?
Go forward, girls.
Go forward, girls. We're also with Seyi Akiwowo, founder and executive director of Glitch, who joins us from London. Glitch, which offers support and advocates against cyber violence. From Brussels, Asha Allen, policy and campaign officer for the European Women's Lobby. And we're also with journalist and author Natasha Henry, who acts as a consultant on gender-based violence. Particularly, you do seminars in the workplace oftentimes. And these months, Natasha, of work from home, how, again, it means we've been in front of screens so much more. And for women, is it fair to say that it's often been and I weigh my words, a violent experience?
Well, I don't have the figures that the other speakers have because I don't have the data yet. But of course, everybody's at home, everybody's frustrated and angry, and all those weird perpetrators have nothing else to do than just hate and go online and hate and threaten. women. So that's very dangerous. I just want to come back to the young girls, like teenagers, because they're a big target and they were always a big target. I would like to say that you could feel very lonely with cyber violence. And as the previous speakers have shown, there is help available. And you should talk about this because no one should stay alone with that problem. And I also need to say to maybe older women, not just teenagers, don't share private stuff that you don't want to, get public. If you don't really trust the guy, don't give your passwords. Don't believe what people say online, because there's cyberbullying, and there are also the others who are, trying to be Prince Charming and are, I don't know, could be like looking for victims of prostitution and trafficking. So I think everybody should be very careful and also know that there are ways out. Facebook and Twitter and all these places, they do have reporting, and you can tell them that something is going wrong. The problem is if you post something now on Facebook and then you've got 20 stupid comments and angry comments, well, that's very difficult to monitor. But as far as you as a private person are with a perpetrator, with an ex-partner or something like that, yes, there are ways to protect yourself.
All right. Lots of comments on the hashtag F24 debate, including this one from Sue. What saddens me greatly is women hating on women, girls hating on girls. We know how online abuse, hatred, bigotry, and harassment feels. So let's not do it to others. Be kind, be gentle, be nice. Aurélia Garnier-Brun, have you witnessed experiences of online hate of women against women?
Of course, it's also linked to what we call internalized sexism, where the norms of sexism are also perpetrated by girls and women. So as we are in a sexist society, of course, we are all sexist, including women. What we see the most, since we focus on intimate partner violence, especially amongst young people, is the amount of young women who experience cyber violence in their violent relationships. In France, we say that 9 women out of 10 who suffers from partner violence also suffers from at least one form of cyber violence. And it's not only a new form of violence, the cyberspace is also a whole new space, a whole new medium for violent partners to maintain this domination, to maintain this violence. And for example, we have our online chat available at commentsem.fr, where we help young women that come to us. And I recall once I was chatting with this woman. She was in a relationship with a man. They were not living together. They were having a long distance relationship. He wasn't even in the city she was living in, but he was constantly harassing her by calls, texts, threatening her if she would not answer by the minute, threatening her family. He would give her calls in the middle of the night, and she always had to answer. And she had the same psychological effects, same traumas as women who were experiencing violence with their partner in their homes. It's just a new way of intruding a victim's life, of exerting this domination, this violence. And working a lot with young women, I guess what we see a lot also is a lot of victim blaming. And I think when we think about cyber violence, we also need to think about our attitude concerning these violences. For example, we tend to think a lot that young women are responsible for the cyber violence they can live because they should not have posted that nude, or they should not be on Instagram. But this kind of reaction is basically saying to a girl it's her fault she was harassed in the street because she was wearing a skirt. This is not the message we should send to young women now. We should educate them on their rights. We should educate them on what they can do if they experience this violence. We should break the taboo. We should break the shame that makes them so afraid to speak out. This is a lot of things we have to do. And with our organization, we do a lot of sensitizations in schools, among professionals such as teachers, the police, and it's really a lot about education and also breaking the myth that online violence is not real violence. The people experiencing this violence are real, and the effects of cyber violence are real, and also the punishments for cyber violence are real because they exist.
So what already give us a tip here. What if you're a young woman or a teenage girl, at what point should alarm bells go off?
As soon as you don't feel safe or respected, and it can come very early. I recall, for example, last week I was on the chat chatting with another young woman, and she was telling me that she was seeing this guy, and she had stopped answering. And kind of as a threat, forcing her to answer, he had sent her the nudes that she had sent him previously. So it was kind of a leverage for this man to kind of put pressure on the woman and on the relationship. And she felt very uncomfortable, but she didn't know if she could talk to the police or thinking about a judiciary response because the threat had not been formulated yet. Yet he has no right to share intimate images of her without her consent. So as soon as someone's consent is not respected, you can talk about it. And really, what we see is young women who are so afraid because they think that if those images, for example, leak on the internet, their social life is over, their professional life is over. And really, we need to break the shame, break the taboo, and they have to break their isolation and come talk to friends, professionals. We need to also learn how to react better to those testimonies because they're crucial for help.
A study in India showed how between 2017 and 2018, instances of cyberbullying of adolescents rose by 36%, while conviction rates fell. The survey showed how in the capital, Delhi, nearly 10% of adolescents had been harassed or bullied online. Seyakiwowo, 2018 can seem like a long time ago in internet years. Would you say that things have gotten better or worse since then?
I think things have gotten worse. Because we haven't had a proper conversation around the education when we're navigating the online space as digital citizens. So how do we talk about online safety, digital self-care and self-defense for the individuals? How do we talk about being an active bystander online when you see online abuse taking place and not being desensitized to it, particularly people with privilege and allyship? How do they use their allyship online to stand with those who are disproportionately impacted by online abuse? Because yes, women are 27 times more likely to be harassed online, but black women are 84% more likely to be mentioned in problematic and abusive tweets. And if we do not talk about intersectionality, then we're going to completely erase the experience of the majority of people on the online space. It's getting worse also because moderation of content is being done by people who, unfortunately, because of lack of transparency, we don't know what gender-based violence training they're receiving, what support they're receiving from having to watch horrific content every single day. And also, COVID lockdown rules has meant that people can't go into work to moderate these platforms. So we saw an increase in Facebook's response to say that they won't be looking at content that is basically not misinformation around COVID. And even that was slack. So, yes, things are getting worse. They're also getting worse because people and women are finally feeling able to tell their story. We saw this time last year in the lead up to the general election in the UK, sadly, women bravely but sadly talking about why they will not stand for public office again. We had never seen that before because of the shame and the stigma for talking about violence. And the same way that we've had and normalized conversations around domestic violence, and we see it in our TV shows, and we've seen educational literature online and offline and on TV and in films, we need to be having that when it comes to the online space so that we can understand when things become blurry and murky in that grey area, when consent can always be withdrawn from the individual, and when we can be holding tech companies to account. And I want to reiterate the importance of this. If we do not talk about this through an intersectional lens, we will not make the online space safe. Because when you look at how online abuse increased during lockdown for women, it was almost 46%. When you look at it for Black and minoritized people and non-binary people, this increased to 50%. The impact on this financially, on careers, on censorship, on human rights is worse for Black women and those with multiple intersecting identities. So this conversation to move forward is going to get worse because we need to talk about it. We need to air out the ugliness. But it's also going to get worse if we don't look and treat online abuse and online safety through an intersectional lens.
All right, and our panel breaking it down into two parts: those that you know intimately, who pick on you or abuse you, and those you don't know at all. A report by the UN Broadband Commission for Digital Development, highlighted by Asha Allen's European Women's Lobby, shows how the digital age creates the climate for unwanted advances, lewd remarks, or worse. There you see the first statistic: women receiving sexually explicit messages by an unknown person, 46% of nearly half. Women receiving inappropriate advances on social media by an unknown person, 73%. Asha Allen, what's it all about?
So it's just as we've reiterated before and what's been mentioned by the previous panelists and what we're seeing in the continuation of women's experiences in the offline space. And I think it's important to reiterate that we've talked a lot about what happens in regards to those intimate partner relationships, but image-based sexual abuse, something where you're sharing the images without the consent of someone else, predominantly happens between a perpetrator who is unknown to the victim in question. And that's actually the majority of the cases. So in a sense, even the way that we talk about this, the language that we use in terms of using terms such as revenge porn or trolling actually kind of sort of diminishes what the reality actually is for many women and girls who are experiencing online gender-based violence. Referring back to the report that you just mentioned there, that highlights that 9 million women in Europe have experienced some form of serious online gender-based violence. But that particular report is in need of subsequent data, such as the great work done by our colleagues at Glitch and that Shay mentioned in the report that they did this year. So it is pervasive, and I think it needs to be reiterated how it affects women, no matter where they are in their life cycle. I think it's important to reiterate that women are experiencing this between colleagues. It can be between strangers, we've mentioned already.
And I'm sure you've grappled with this, but what's it all about? Is it just because men who perhaps feel powerless can hit send and pick on someone else?
I think it's still because we live within a patriarchal society where sexism and misogyny remains pervasive. We really have to reinforce the point that what we're seeing online is just a continuation of women's lived realities. And trying to kind of quantify why people kind of engage in this way in this online space, of course, we can talk about elements such as anonymity and freedom from impunity and the lack of regulation that exists, and the fact that the platforms and the content moderation that have and the provisions that have been put in so far have done little to nothing to be able to protect people from the violence that they experience there. But this needs to be part of that broader conversation of what is the reality of women and girls, not only in Europe but globally, and the amount of violence that they continue to experience. 1 in 3 women in the world globally have experienced some form of violence against women. And this is why we mark this day on the 25th to raise awareness that this is still continuing and is still a pervasive issue, and that it's crossed the border into our digital world and our digital societies. Are we approaching in any way a watershed moment? It's been promised to us when it comes to reining in the lawlessness of cyberspace, because we've been talking a lot about disinformation in the build-up to the U.S. presidential election, for instance. Do you feel on this issue that perhaps soon there is going to be a reckoning? I would hope so, not specifically just on this issue, but of course in women's rights, gender equality and human rights more broadly, as we kind of embrace the circumstances and scenarios that we find ourselves in globally. I would reiterate, of course, what's been said on the panel in regards to moving this conversation forward. the pandemic definitely exacerbated the experience that many women and girls were having in regards to online gender-based violence, but this was pervasive for at least the decade beforehand, and very much so in the last 5 years. And it's become more higher on the political agenda, I would say, in the last few years because of the elections, because of the prevalence of social media platforms and their recognition of how important they are when it comes to these particular situations. So what I would hope is that we are able to take this conversation forward into actual comprehensive action that is multi-level and multi-stakeholder and most importantly, holistic in its analysis and intersectional in its implementation. We need a comprehensive legal framework that governs the space, but specifically a comprehensive legal framework to combat violence against women, preventative as well as protection measures in Europe. What we need is for there to be clearer measures and clearer responsibilities and clearer duty of care by platforms in order to ensure that this is not the reality on the tech side. And there needs to be consistent and effective implementation on the ground and alliances and working with women's civil society to make sure that impact is felt by women and girls on the ground.
Sei Akiwowo, when you look at all the social media platforms that are out there, I mean, just to name a few, Twitter, Instagram, and now TikTok, which has become so popular, is there one that's perhaps needs the most attention fast?
I think they all do, because as mentioned by other panelists, the demographics, different demographics and generations are using different platforms. So the youngest of our generation are on TikTok and are on Instagram, and therefore a lot more impressionable and a lot more vulnerable, and therefore it requires our attention. But then you look at platforms like Twitter, where so much of public debate and discussion and democracy is being discussed on the platform. That also seems to be a problem. And then you see so much research being done on the impact of online abuse on Twitter, where we know that women are every 30 seconds a woman is abused on Twitter, Amnesty International found. But that is because Twitter is transparent with its data, and that's what I'd like to see other platforms do. Be transparent, allow academics and policymakers and civil society to be able to capture and create data sets to be able to track what is going on and to make their platform safer for their users.
Before we go, Natasha Henry, I want to pick up on a point that Aurélie Garnier-Brun made earlier about how to handle this. And she said the first thing that's the most important is to talk about it. And in the workshops that you do, how do you get that message across?
Well, as soon as you have several women around the table, you'll get the Me Too effect. You know, that's what happens. Someone will say, this and this happened to me, and then someone else will say, oh wow, it happened to me as well. So in the groups it's different, but the advice I would give is, yes, talk about it, because someone will believe you, you know, someone will understand what you're saying. Talk to someone whom you trust. The other advice we give in cases of sexual harassment, for instance, is take screenshots of everything you receive. Keep the evidence, because one of these days you might go to the police and you might, you know, file a complaint, because all this is illegal. I mean, we've wasted a lot of time. Someone mentioned 10 years. Yes, we have wasted a lot of time because no one really cared about this before. We were all really worried about domestic violence and all the violence against women and girls. But I guess now, because of all the conspiracy theories and all the whatever happened with the American elections, now everybody suddenly is finally admitting that there's a problem with the online abuse. And with that, they see that there's a problem with online abuse of women and girls. So this is why it took so long. But now we are all aware of this. It is illegal. It is illegal to threaten someone online, to share private information, to do, you know, all sorts of sexual harassments and threats, and all this is illegal. So I guess, yes, people will believe you. There are very, very good groups like have been mentioned before in France and in Europe in general, and if you talk about this, someone will mention you. But the first step is to understand if you're a victim of this kind of abuse, as in all kind of violence, you are not to blame. You are not guilty. He is or they are guilty. So as soon as you get rid of this guilt feeling, which most victims have, then you will talk about it, talk to someone you trust and find help. And all this is illegal, it is forbidden. And yes, I couldn't agree more with what my colleagues have said just before, which was we need to educate the youth at schools about all this, and we need to have a comprehensive approach, and we need to put an end to this bullying online.
And I know that it's something that the French government's been tasked with picking up on, how to bring that message into the schools. Natacha Henry, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Aurélie Garnier-Brun, Asha Allen, Sei Akiwowo. We want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.